So this afternoon, council members, I'm here to discuss the 2019 through 2020 short-term vacation rental stats for all of you. And this, as the city manager indicated earlier, this is from the police department calls for service. Between October 19 and November 2020, the communications center at the police department received a total of 809 short-term vacation rental related calls for service. As you can see in the bar graph, hopefully you all can see it. You see each month based on calls for service received within the communications center. Our lowest month was January of 2020, where the police department only received 19 total calls for service. Our highest month was November of 2020, when we took in a total of 136 calls for service into our dispatch center. Of note, going from June 2020 through November of 2020, we see steady increases in a few of those months during that time frame. Next slide, please. Of the 809 calls for service regarding short-term vacation rentals, and breaking down those calls for service, we noticed that several of the complaints were regarding disruptive and in some cases illegal behavior by short-term vacation rental renters and guests, including loud late night parties, crowds coming in and out of residential neighborhoods, and increased criminal activity.
Chief Crum, may I ask you a question, please? This is Nancy Ross.
Yes, ma'am.
On your last slide, you had two different colors in your graph. Can you tell me the differentiation?
Yes, 2019 is orange.
I
and
see.
2020 is blue.
And then can you also hypothesize on why, as the pandemic got worse and worse, the numbers got higher and higher? Do you think more people were just traveling because they were housebound?
I believe we could certainly equate the higher numbers calls for service on a couple of factors. One being the pandemic itself. I believe our community and surrounding communities, even throughout the state, were growing weary of the pandemic and the various lockdowns that were put into place. And I think in some respects, people chose to travel. And we became one of those destination cities as a result of a place to escape reality is kind of the best way for me to put it. Other than that, I don't have specific factors or causes as to seeing such an increase towards the latter half of 2020.
And then lastly, and I don't know if you have this answer, it might be Charlie, was it just the early December when we actually prohibited STVRs? Is that correct? December 6th, maybe 8th?
That's correct. The most recent the most recent order that affected that operation of short-term vacation rentals and the hospitality industry in general was effective December 6th.
Thank you.
Chief, also around June, that's when the state mandate was also lifted in regards to STVRs. Is that correct, Charlie? That's why the uptick that STVRs started operating again around June or July, I believe.
That was lifted on June 12th.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to break down for council and keeping in mind of the 809 total calls for service that came into the dispatch center during our previously stated timelines, 15 of those calls resulted in a crime report that took place at a short-term vacation rental location. Of those 15, 9 resulted in arrests being made by the police department. In total, in that timeline, we issued 52 citations that were issued by the police department. Of another interest, I wanted to also show the community and the council and city staff a breakdown of average time that a police officer is spending on an STVR related call for service. And that average time is 21 minutes and 46 seconds per call for service.
Chief,
Next
can I
slide.
interrupt you for a second?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Now, when you have some of those calls, it's not just one officer that shows up to these calls. Sometimes there's numerous officers that show up to these calls. So the amount of time will be greatly increased by that. Is that correct?
It is correct, but what I did was break it down on average per call. We spend total personnel. We spend 21 minutes and 46 seconds at that call for service.
Okay,
but you are correct. Some of those calls are multiple officers responding, but not every officer will stay till the end of the call necessarily.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse
You're
me,
welcome.
Chief.
Yes, sir.
For clarity, on the burglary residential, is that mean where they were staying, they stole something from there, or was it in the neighborhood was the burglary? The burglary, I guess, is breaking into a house or a car or something?
That's correct, and I'll get into that in my next slide.
Okay, I'll wait. Thank you, sir.
Okay, sir. So in breaking down the 15 calls for service that I spoke about earlier, that resulted in crime reports being taken by the police department. One was an attempted murder. This particular crime occurred in the 68,000 block of Tachiva. That was an event where it was an employer-based retreat that was held at the short-term vacation rental at that location. During the time of these co-workers at this work retreat, an argument broke out, which ended up in a double stabbing that occurred at that location, in which an arrest was made by the police department. The second crime I want to talk about is the sexual assault. That crime occurred in the 30,000 block of Winter Road. And on this particular event, our victim was attending a party that was being held at the short-term vacation rental on Winter Road. And during the course of the party, she was drugged. In other words, her drink appeared to have been spiked. And once she was rendered unconscious, she was taken to another location where she was sexually assaulted. So as the police department did the investigation, we learned that the victim had been drugged at the vacation rental. However, she was assaulted at a second location. And one of the other assaults I would like to talk about briefly occurred in the 30,000 block of Avenida Eximino. This particular short-term vacation rental during this weekend was hosting 3 families who were renting this location. And during the course of their weekend, both the police department and fire department were dispatched to the location regarding near drowning of a child. And in that particular case, we ended up conducting a child endangerment investigation, which was forwarded to the district attorney's office for filing. And to go back to Councilman Carnevale's question regarding residential burglaries, in the 5 residential burglaries that I have on this slide, you are correct. Those thefts occurred at the vacation rental. So for example, renters left after their weekend stay, and the owners of the vacation rentals in these cases were typically the victims where items had been stolen from their vacation rental itself. Does that answer your question, Councilman Carnevale?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You are welcome. And if there are no other questions related to the actual breakdown of the Part 1 crimes, I'm ready to move to the next slide. So looking at our compliance team, and as the city manager indicated, this team, with support of this city council, we were able to get this team up and running. They actually went live on November 13th of 2020. And I wanted to break down for the council and the community the number of calls for service that this team has handled in that short time frame, being November 13th through November 30th of 2020. 517 total calls have been handled by this team. What's important on that number is 136 of those calls were short-term vacation rental related. 110 of the 136 were actually handled by this new compliance team, and the remaining 26 STVR related calls were handled by our patrol officers. In breaking that data down, ideally the 26 calls for service that were handled by police officers tended to occur prior to November 13th of 2020. And during the month of November, more so in the 2-week timeline of November 13th through the 30th, our team did issue 12 citations during that short 2-week period.
Chief, were those citations issued for illegal occupancy during a time period that they weren't allowed to be, or are you just talking about the November period of time?
Just the 2 weeks in November, yes.
Have you subsequently began ticketing people for actual occupancy?
We have, if we can establish the violation, and we are noticing that many of our calls for service currently, the renters are actually long-term rentals. In other words, they're staying more than 30 days. So they're not currently violating the current orders that are in place, but we are investigating each and every call that we do receive.
Chief, legally, 30 days or less is considered a short-term vacation rental?
Yes, I believe it's under 30 days.
Okay.
So I do happen to know that it is a policy now of some of the STVR owners to give them 30-day contracts for the weekend.
Right. And that is requiring us to follow up. So if we do make contact with a renter that indicates they have a 30-day or longer stay, then our team is following up on that to ensure that that is in fact the case. If it's not the case, then an administrative citation will be issued in those cases.
And Chief, just to clarify, you're not saying that there have been no citations issued for that violation. You're just saying not all of the calls have ended up in citation. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Now, Chief, are we keeping records to make sure that we don't get multiple calls from the same property and on different weekends, and there's different people at that property stating that each had a 30-day contract?
Well, we are responding to every complaint that we receive.
Yes, but per property, are we keeping records to make sure that, for instance, weekend number 1, X, Y, and Z leaves the property. Weekend number 2, they have a 30-day contract. Weekend number 2, Mr. Smith is renting the property for 30 days. Week number 3 is a different property, a different person, same property. Are we keeping records of what's going on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm ready for the next slide. The other component is our partners in public safety here in our city, and that I wanted to break down the fire department calls for service that related to short-term vacation rentals, again, using the same October 2019 through November of 2020. And you can see that our fire department responded to a total of 241 short-term vacation rental calls for service during that timeline. And 56 of those calls were October through December of 2019, and 185 have occurred from January 1 of 2020 through November 30th of 2020. Specifically looking at the graph, which is to my right, the bar graph, you can see that the majority of fire department calls for service that had occurred in this timeline, 183 being medical aids. The second highest number is 35, which is public service responses where they have called the fire department to assist them. Perhaps they've fallen and other type situations like that that would not be classified as a medical aid by our fire department. Specifically, I want to talk about two incidents that our fire department handled, one being in July of 2020, in which our fire department was dispatched to the 28,000 block of West Natoma, and that resulted in a fire from a barbecue at a short-term vacation rental. And secondly, our fire department in November of 2020 handled a fire in the 68,000 block of 30th Avenue, and that fire was caused by a faulty pool equipment. So we have our fire department has handled two fire incidents really in short order, both in July and in November of 2020. Looking at the average time spent on these calls for service of our fire department, it is on average 37 minutes and 46 seconds per call for service that our fire department members are on these calls. And I believe, Tracy, that is my last slide, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to my part of this presentation.
Are there additional questions for the chief?
Yeah, Chief, were there any parking citations that you have on record from any of these STVRs as well?
Yes, I did not break those down by sheer numbers, but our team is issuing a very large number of parking citations, whether they on view them, in other words, they see them themselves, or members of the community are reporting them, and we are going out and issuing citations as a result of that complaint.
Were those citations a part of your presentation here, or they're in addition to?
In addition to.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, if there's no other questions, let's move on to code compliance. Sandra Molina.
Yes, thank you, members of the City Council. So I'm going to go ahead and provide data from our Code Compliance Division from October to November 12th, 2020. Our sources for short-term vacation rental complaints come through the hotline, which is a 24/7 hotline that's staffed. Also from Go Request, which is both web-based and app-based onto a smartphone. And then we do get referrals, not very many, but a few referrals from the police department and other sources such as email, fire department, or phone itself. But for that time period, we have 761 complaints. And as indicated by City Manager McClendon, we were very careful to make sure that we did not double count the numbers. And calls that directly went to dispatch also were not included in our stats. That's included in the police department stats. So our complaints by month, and Tracy, I think you might have go back one, please. Yeah, so now go forward. There you go. Thank you very much. We broke down our complaints, the 761, by the type of complaint that we got, the complaint category. And as you can see, music and noise by far is the biggest number of complaints that we get. It's over 60% of the total calls for that time period. During that time, the second highest number of calls we received were during the emergency order that the city had and the county had as well with regard to short-term vacation rentals. We had 96 during that time period that the orders were in effect. Tracy, can you go to the next one? Thank you. So we also have broken down our complaints by month during that time period. And as you can see, during the times of June, July, August, and September, which are the summer months, we did have a higher number of complaints. During that time, again, the majority of our complaints are noise and music related. For instance, in June, 38 of those 69 calls were for music and noise. And in July, 105 of them, about 70% of the calls were music and noise complaints. And that's consistent. In August, 60 of the calls were for music and noise, and in September it was 58, in October it was 61. So as the stats show, music and noise is probably our biggest complaints that we receive.
Sandra, quick question.
Sure.
Out of the music and noise, how many of those calls resulted in a citation? If you have that information.
No, I don't have that information. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if I could just follow up really quick on Councilmember Gutierrez's question. We don't have that information. A lot of the times it was after the fact. We would come in, after the weekend and follow up and also contact the police department. So we were not having that 24/7 coverage during that time. It was more difficult to inspect or investigate the complaint and then results in citations.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, I'll speak to this one. If there there are often questions asked about how many of our short-term vacation rentals are in what I call the open communities versus the HOA communities, and what is our revenue. And we've always said that about a third of our licensed STVRs are in HOA neighborhoods. It turns out that for 1920, exactly 1/3 of our licensed short-term vacation rentals are in HOA communities, 130 and 490 in of the 390 total. Bottom lines are the revenue that the city receives: business licenses, permits, and transaction occupancy tax, commonly known as TOT. I would draw your attention to the far right-hand column in red. That's the revenue from the licenses in the HOA communities that would be unaffected by the ordinance. And also I would note on this, the permit revenue, all of this was for the 1920 fiscal year, which ended June 30th. So none of this in terms of the permit revenue reflects the increased fees that went into effect in October. Tracy. Now, the other question that we're commonly asked and is an issue that many in the community have brought up is, what effect do short-term rentals have regarding housing availability? And so we did gather some data. It's difficult to make a direct causal relationship. However, these items are undeniable. Housing prices in Cathedral City increased by 19.9% from November 2019 through November 2020. That was a one-year period, a 20% increase in housing prices. Now, if you own a home here, that's good news for you. That means your housing, the value of your home has gone up. If you're looking to buy or rent a home, that makes it harder and harder for you to achieve affordability. And there just is not enough housing available in Cathedral City, and actually statewide, that's a recognized problem. The legislature has taken all kinds of actions to mandate that we increase our housing supply and a number of things like that. Having homes removed from the residential market and operated like hotels for recreational STVR purposes further exacerbates the effect of the already tight housing market. One of the goals of the council in adopting the STVR restrictions is to protect housing availability for more local, year-round working families, seniors, and other residents. And the housing pinch is not limited to just Cathedral City. Housing inventory valley-wide dropped by 42% over the past year. And what that is a measure of is the number of homes on the market for sale has decreased. And so we do not have that particular number just for Cathedral City, but I think that you would find the same trend if you looked at just Cathedral City data. All right, and I think that concludes the presentation.